After losing everything in a bitter divorce, a 64-year-old veteran drove 9 hours through the rain to reach the only thing left in his name: a collapsing fishing cabin buried deep in the Cascade foothills of Washington state. He thought it was the end. But 3 nights later, his German shepherd started digging at the cabin floor. And what lay beneath those rotting boards had been sealed away since 1897. When Colton Mercer stepped out of that courthouse in Spokane, he carried nothing but a manila envelope and a set of truck keys. 31 years of marriage reduced to a signature and a handshake with a lawyer he couldn't afford. The only possession the court left him was a 15-acre plot along the Skagit River, deep in the mountain timber, inherited from a grandfather he barely remembered. Most people would have called it a dead end, but Colton wasn't walking out alone. Beside him, moving with the quiet discipline of a soldier who never learned to stand down, was Boone. The German shepherd had been at Colton's side for nearly 11 years. Found half-starved behind a supply depot in Kandahar, the dog had been scheduled for disposal after his handler was killed by a roadside blast. Colton had carried the animal onto an outbound transport and never looked back. Since that day, Boone had followed him through 3 deployments, 2 surgeries, a medical discharge, and now this. Before we begin this incredible story, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and old paper. Colton walked slowly toward the exit, his boots landing with the measured rhythm of a man who still carried the posture of a ranger, even at 64. Behind him, the courtroom doors closed with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Diane was already gone. She had left through a different exit 15 minutes earlier, walking arm in arm with Russell Pratt, the real estate developer she had been seeing for the last 2 years of their marriage. Colton had found out about Russell the way most men found out about these things. Not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a phone left unlocked on a kitchen counter. Text messages, photos, plans for a future that didn't include him. The divorce had been fast after that. Diane's attorney argued that Colton's military pension, the house in Spokane, the savings account, the 2 vehicles, all of it represented shared marital assets. The judge agreed with most of it. What remained was the fishing cabin along the Skagit, a structure Colton's grandfather, a Korean war mechanic named Owen Mercer, had built in the early 1960s with his own hands. Owen had purchased the land cheap from a timber company that had stripped the old-growth Douglas fir and moved on. He spent summers there alone, fishing for steelhead and reading paperback westerns on the porch. When Owen died in 1989, the property passed to Colton's father. When Colton's father died during a deployment to Iraq, it passed again. Colton had never visited. Not once. Now it was the only ground he could stand on. Diane's attorney had described it during the hearing with barely concealed amusement. The property consists of an unimproved structure on 15 acres of undeveloped forest land. No electricity, no running water, no assessed market value of significance. Diane had looked across the courtroom at Colton one last time. She wore a silk blouse he didn't recognize and earrings he had never seen before. She said nothing, but her expression carried a message clear enough. "You're finished." Colton pushed open the courthouse doors and stepped into the gray Spokane afternoon. October wind cut through his jacket. Rain was coming. He could smell it the way he had always been able to smell weather changes, a skill the Army sharpened and civilian life never dulled. Boone stood up from where he had been waiting beside the truck, tail still, eyes locked on Colton's face. The dog always knew. Colton crouched and placed both hands on the shepherd's broad neck. "Well," he said quietly. Boone pressed his head into Colton's chest. That was it. No ceremony, no goodbye. Just a man and his dog standing in a parking lot while the sky turned the color of steel. Colton climbed into the truck, set the manila envelope on the dashboard, and started the engine. The road out of Spokane unrolled in front of him like a long gray ribbon heading west. Behind him, the city shrank until it disappeared completely. Ahead, the Cascades waited. The drive took most of the day. Highway turned to county road. County road turned to gravel. Gravel turned to a dirt track so narrow that branches scraped both sides of the truck like fingers trying to hold him back. Boone sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, watching the forest close in around them. The rain started somewhere around Marblemount. Not heavy, just steady. The kind of Pacific Northwest rain that didn't announce itself but simply arrived and stayed. By the time Colton found the turnoff, marked only by a rusted metal post half buried in blackberry bushes, the afternoon light had gone flat and gray. The truck crawled the last quarter-mile through mud and standing water. Then the trees parted. The cabin sat at the far edge of a small clearing, backed against a slope of old-growth cedar and hemlock. The Skagit River was somewhere nearby. Colton could hear it through the trees, a deep, steady rush like the breathing of something enormous. The cabin itself looked like it had been losing a slow war against the forest for decades. The roof had caved in on the right side. One wall buckled outward where water damage had softened the timber. The porch had collapsed entirely, leaving a pile of gray boards scattered across the mud. Moss covered nearly every surface. Ferns grew through gaps in the foundation. A rusted wood stove pipe jutted from the remains of the roof at an odd angle like a broken finger pointing at the sky. Colton turned off the engine and sat there. Rain tapped steadily on the truck roof. Boone whined softly. Colton stared at the cabin. Diane would have laughed if she could see this. She probably was laughing, somewhere in Spokane, sitting in Russell Pratt's heated living room with a glass of wine, imagining Colton standing in the rain looking at a ruin. He opened the door. Boone jumped out first. The dog hit the muddy ground and immediately began circling the clearing, nose down, moving with the careful intensity of an animal, cataloging every scent in a new territory. Colton pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the cabin. Up close, the damage was worse than it had looked from the truck. The front wall had a hole large enough to climb through without using the door. The remaining windows were shattered. Animal droppings littered the entrance. Colton pushed the warped door open. It scraped against the floor with a sound like a groan. Inside, the air was cold and damp and smelled of rotting wood and earth. The single room was small, maybe 15 feet by 20. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its mortar crumbling but the stone still solid. A handmade wooden shelf hung crookedly above a counter that had warped into a shallow curve. The floor was wide plank boards, dark with age and moisture. Some had buckled upward. Others had gaps between them wide enough to see dirt below. Colton stood in the center of the room and looked up. Through the collapsed section of roof, he could see gray sky and the tops of cedar trees swaying in the rain. Boone entered behind him and began sniffing along the baseboards, moving methodically from corner to corner. Colton exhaled. He had slept in worse places. Foxholes in Afghanistan that filled with sand during windstorms. Concrete bunkers in Iraq where the temperature reached 130 degrees. A collapsed observation post in the Korengal Valley, where he spent 42 hours pinned down by sniper fire, with nothing but a canteen and a broken radio. This was better than all of those. At least here, nobody was shooting at him. He spent the remaining daylight doing what he could. He dragged a sheet of corrugated metal from the truck bed and wedged it across the worst gap in the roof. He swept animal debris from the floor near the fireplace. He stacked kindling he found beneath a cedar that had kept the wood mostly dry. The fire took 3 tries to catch. When it finally did, the small flames threw orange light across the stone walls, and for the first time, the cabin felt like something other than a grave. Boone lay down beside the fire and rested his chin on his paws. Colton sat with his back against the hearth and ate cold beans from a can. Rain hammered the metal patch above them. The forest beyond the walls was completely dark now. The river's voice filled the silence. Colton closed his eyes. For a moment, the sound of rain became something else. Rotor wash. The thudding pulse of a Black Hawk coming in low over a burning village. He could smell diesel fuel and copper. His hands clenched. Then a warm weight pressed against his ribs. Colton opened his eyes. Boone had moved closer without a sound and now lay firmly against his side. Steady breathing pushing gently against Colton's body. The helicopter faded. The cabin returned. Rain and river and the soft crackle of fire. Colton rested his hand on Boone's head. "I know," he said. Boone's tail moved once against the floor. They slept that way, pressed together beside the dying fire, while the Cascade Mountains stood dark and silent around them, and the river kept its endless watch through the night. 3 days passed. Colton fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Mornings began at first light, the way they always had. Coffee was instant powder mixed with river water boiled over the fire. Breakfast was whatever canned food remained in the duffel bag. After eating, he worked. The roof needed the most attention. Colton salvaged boards from the collapsed porch and used them to patch the worst sections. He sealed the broken windows with plastic sheeting and duct tape. He cleared debris from the fireplace flue until the chimney drew properly and smoke stopped filling the room. The work was hard. His shoulders burned. His hands blistered and bled, but the rhythm of it, hammer, measure, cut, nail, did something he hadn't expected. It quieted the noise. No courtroom, no Diane, no Russell Pratt smiling with his expensive teeth. Just the weight of a hammer and the smell of wet cedar. Boone supervised everything. The dog followed Colton from task to task, occasionally carrying a stick to drop near the work area as if contributing materials. When Colton rested, Boone rested beside him. When Colton moved, Boone moved first. On the third evening, Colton sat on the repaired porch and watched the last light drain from the sky above the mountains. The river glowed silver through the trees. An eagle passed overhead without a sound. He looked down at Boone. "Not bad for a couple of old soldiers," he said. Boone's ears twitched. Colton almost smiled. That night, something changed. Colton woke to the sound of scratching. Not outside, inside. He opened his eyes. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was dark except for a faint red glow from the hearth. Boone was not beside him. Colton sat up. Across the room near the far corner where the floor met the stone foundation of the fireplace, Boone was digging. The dog's claws scraped against the wooden planks with a rhythmic, insistent sound. His body was tense. His breathing was fast. This wasn't idle exploration. This was focused. Deliberate. "Boone," Colton said quietly. The dog didn't stop. Colton stood and walked over. Boone glanced up briefly, then returned to scratching at the same spot on the floor. One of the old planks had already loosened under his claws. Colton knelt beside him. "Easy. What'd you find?" He pressed his hand flat against the board. Boone had been working on. The wood was softer here than the rest of the floor. Damp. Colton knocked on it. Thud. He knocked 2 inches to the left. Thud. He knocked where Boone had been scratching hollow. Colton felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He grabbed a pry bar from his toolkit. Boone stepped back but kept his eyes locked on the spot. Colton wedged the bar beneath the plank. The wood split easily, rotten and soft. He pulled it free. Beneath it was not the packed dirt he expected. There was a gap, a space. Cold air rose from below, carrying a smell of earth and stone and something else, something metallic and old. Colton grabbed his flashlight and shone it down into the opening. The beam revealed a shallow cellar, maybe 4 feet deep, dug into the rocky ground beneath the cabin. And sitting at the bottom, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, were 3 objects. A wooden crate, its lid nailed shut, a leather satchel, cracked and dark with age, and a glass jar sealed with wax containing what looked like chunks of dark rock. Colton stared. Boone barked once, sharp and proud. Colton lowered himself carefully into the opening. The cellar floor was packed earth, cold and slightly damp. He reached for the leather satchel first. The buckle broke apart in his hands. The metal so corroded it crumbled like dried clay. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Folded, yellowed, brittle at the edges. Colton carried the satchel back up into the cabin and spread the documents near the firelight. The handwriting was precise but faded. Dates appeared on several pages. 1893, 1895, 1897. Colton unfolded a large sheet carefully. It was a survey map, hand-drawn, with elevation lines, creek markings, and compass bearings rendered in dark ink. A circle had been drawn in red near the center of the map, along a ridge above the river. Beside the circle, in small neat letters, someone had written, "Primary copper seam. Grade exceptional. Depth unknown." The name at the bottom of the survey read Josiah Colburn, Mineral Surveyor, Skagit County, Washington Territory, 1896. Colton's hands were shaking. He opened the glass jar next. Inside were rock samples, dark and heavy, shot through with veins of green and reddish metal that caught the firelight and glowed. Copper ore. Even with no mining background, Colton recognized it. The wooden crate required the pry bar. Inside were more documents. Correspondence between Colburn and a financier in Seattle, discussing investment in a mining operation along the Skagit. The final letter, dated March 1897, explained everything. Financial panic had frozen capital markets across the Pacific Northwest. The investor had withdrawn. Colburn had sealed his survey materials beneath the cabin floor and written a single final line. "The mountain keeps what men cannot afford to take." Colton sat back against the wall. The fire crackled softly. Rain tapped the repaired roof. Boone walked over and sat beside him, tail sweeping the dusty floor. Colton looked at the map, then toward the door, beyond which the ridge rose dark against the night sky. "Diane called this place worthless," he said quietly. Boone leaned against his shoulder. Colton ran his thumb across the faded red circle on the map. "I think she might have been wrong about that." Morning light hit the Cascades like cold water poured over stone. The rain had stopped during the night, and the forest steamed gently in the early sun. Colton loaded the documents into a waterproof bag and drove to Concrete, the nearest town with more than a gas station. Boone rode shotgun as always. The town was small. A hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a feed supply, and a narrow office beside the post office with a brass plaque that read Harlan Foss, licensed geologist. Harlan Foss turned out to be a lean man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and hands, stained permanently gray from decades of handling rock samples. He studied Colton's documents in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Then he examined the ore samples under a desk lamp, turning each piece slowly. "Where exactly did you find these?" he asked, his voice careful. "Under my cabin floor." "Along the Skagit, up past Rockport." Harlan set the sample down gently. "This is high-grade copper ore." Colton waited. Harlan tapped the survey map. "If this Colburn fellow was accurate, and from what I can see, his methodology was sound, you could be sitting on a significant deposit." "How significant?" Harlan removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "Significant enough that you should not be telling anyone about this until you've secured your legal position completely." Colton nodded. He understood. He had spent enough years in combat to know that valuable ground attracted enemies. Over the following weeks, Colton returned to the ridge above the cabin. He hiked carefully along the terrain, comparing the old survey map to the landscape. The creek Colburn had marked still ran in the same channel. The rock formations matched, and when Colton chipped into an exposed section of stone near the ridgeline, thin veins of green copper ore glinted back at him in the afternoon light. Harlan visited twice. Each time, the geologist left more convinced. Colton began small-scale extraction from a surface trench along the ridge. The first samples he brought to a processing facility in Mount Vernon returned results that made the technician double-check her equipment. "This is unusually pure," she said. Colton said nothing. He drove back to the cabin with the results folded in his jacket pocket. Boone met him on the porch with a wagging tail. "We're not done yet," Colton told him. Word traveled the way it always does in small places, through diner conversations and hardware store gossip, and the quiet observations of people who noticed an old truck making regular trips between a mountain cabin and a geology office. Colton was careful, but careful had limits when strangers started asking questions. 6 months after the discovery, Colton was splitting firewood beside the cabin when he heard an engine on the access road. He set down the axe. Boone stood immediately, hackles rising. A black SUV emerged from the trees and stopped at the edge of the clearing. The door opened. Diane stepped out. Colton hadn't seen her in nearly a year. She looked different, thinner. Her hair was shorter. She wore a coat that probably cost more than Colton's monthly grocery budget. Behind her, Russell Pratt emerged from the driver's side, still polished, still smiling, still wearing a watch that caught the sunlight like a signal mirror. A third figure stepped from the back seat, a woman in a dark suit carrying a document folder, a lawyer. Colton wiped his hands on his jeans and waited. Diane crossed the clearing toward him. Her heels sank into the soft ground with each step. She stopped about 10 feet away. "You've been busy," she said. Colton looked past her toward the mountains. "Some." Russell stepped forward. "We've heard about the mineral deposits on this property," he said, skipping pleasantries entirely. "There may have been an oversight during the divorce proceedings regarding subsurface rights." The lawyer opened her folder. "We're prepared to file a claim." Colton reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded document. He held it out. The lawyer took it and read silently. Her expression shifted. She looked up at Russell, then at Diane. "The mineral rights were explicitly included in the land transfer," the lawyer said. "The deed is clear." Colton's voice was steady. "My grandfather bought this land. My father inherited it. I inherited it from him. It was never marital property. Inherited assets were excluded from the settlement." The judge confirmed it. Diane stared at him. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the divorce, she had nothing to say. Colton rested his hand on Boone's head. The dog stood perfectly still beside him, watching the visitors with calm, dark eyes. "You should go," Colton said. Not with anger, not with satisfaction. Just a fact. Diane turned and walked back to the SUV. Her heels left small holes in the mud. Russell followed, his smile gone. The lawyer hesitated, glanced once more at the document, then joined them. The SUV reversed down the access road and disappeared into the trees. Colton stood in the clearing until the engine sound faded completely. Then he looked down at Boone. Boone wagged his tail once. 2 years later, the clearing along the Skagit had changed in ways Colton never imagined when he first arrived in the rain with nothing but a duffel bag and a dog. The original cabin still stood. Colton refused to tear it down. A new log home had been built beside it, solid and warm, with a stone fireplace and a wide porch that faced the river. The mining operation on the ridge was modest by industry standards. Colton had rejected every offer from large corporations. Instead, he hired locally, men and women from Concrete and Marblemount who needed steady work. Several were veterans. They arrived the way Colton had arrived, carrying invisible weight, looking for solid ground. Colton understood them without needing to ask. He offered work, fair wages, and a place where silence wasn't uncomfortable. The community grew slowly. 2 more cabins went up near the tree line, a shared workshop, a small equipment shed. The operation produced enough copper to sustain everyone involved without destroying the mountain that provided it. Boone had grown older. His muzzle was white now. The energy that once drove him on long patrols around the clearing had softened into a careful, deliberate walk. He still made his rounds every morning, but he rested more often, usually on the porch in a patch of sunlight, watching the workers move along the ridge with the quiet satisfaction of a commander observing a well-run operation. One evening in late autumn, Colton sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The Cascades had turned gold and red along the lower slopes. The river moved silver and quiet through the valley below. Smoke rose from the other cabins. Someone was playing guitar faintly near the workshop. Boone lay beside Colton's chair, his head resting on his front paws. His breathing was slow and even. Colton reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, the same ears that had pricked forward in a dusty Afghan compound 11 years ago. The same ears that had listened through courthouse hallways and long, silent highways and cold mountain nights when the only sound was rain on a broken roof. "You know something?" Colton said softly. Boone's tail moved once. Colton looked out across the clearing. The old cabin, the new home, the lights in the trees, the quiet voices of people who had found their way here the same way he had. Broken, discarded, given up on. "She thought this was the end for me," Colton said. Boone lifted his head and looked at him. Colton smiled. But you knew better, didn't you? The wind moved through the cedars. The river kept its steady voice. The mountains stood dark and patient against a sky full of early stars. And beside a man who had once owned nothing, an old German shepherd rested in the warmth of a life he had helped build from the ground up. Sometimes the most valuable thing hidden beneath your feet isn't copper or silver or gold. Sometimes it's a second chance, and sometimes the one who finds it for you has 4 legs, a scarred paw, and a heart that never once considered giving up on you. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe a loyal dog can truly change a person's life, type 1 in the comments. If you believe every veteran deserves a second chance, type 0. And tell us where you're watching from today. It's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Noble Veteran Dogs and turn on notifications. We share stories about veterans, loyal dogs, and the quiet moments that change everything. And trust me, the next story might be the one that stays with you the longest.